William McQuillan, partner at Frontline Ventures, believes that the Europe versus US rivalry misses the point entirely. Having risen to become one of Europe's leading firms, Frontline has proven that investing in both markets as a European firm delivers a true competitive edge. In his talk, William challenges prevailing competitive narratives, emphasizing that thinking big means thinking globally, even for VCs building firms out of Europe. Border wars don't build big companies. Collaboration and relentless execution across borders do.
What's interesting today when I look at the summit agenda is that almost 40 or a little over 40% of the talks today are in some way talking about the issues Europe is facing because of a changing US agenda, or in some cases even going further and talking about how Europe needs to be more isolationist, protective, or just more Europe focused on Europe. And I think for me, that does miss the point a little bit. And I think we need to be careful as long-term investors not to become too isolationist in our own thinking and to continue to think globally. For me at Frontline, that's something that's very important. Our fund is built on international expansion. Our early stage fund helps European companies expand into the US, and our growth stage fund helps US companies expand into Europe. For us, we try to be experts in transatlantic expansion, but more importantly than that, transatlantic collaboration. You know, one of the things I love to show when talking about how much our two regions work together without even kind of realizing it is, the map in front of you is a map of all the undersea fiber optic cables around the world. There's a little over 500 of them. And what's interesting is a lot of people think that a lot of data is going through satellites every day, but actually 97 to 99% of all the global internet traffic is going through those fiber optic cables. If you look at Europe and the US as two regions, actually only 3% of those cables are connecting Europe and the US. So you could say that doesn't sound like two ecosystems that collaborate very much. But when you look at the data going across those 17 cables, it's actually a little over 45% of all the world's global internet data every single day is crossing those 17 cables. The two ecosystems are incredibly well connected and collaborating on a data level every single day. So if we are so connected, why is it then that we're seeing so many people talking more and more about more region-focused isolationist views? Well, from a European perspective, I think I can get it. You have the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense talking about hating and loathing Europe in messages. You have Donald Trump frequently putting messages out, critiquing Europe. I would say actually very frequently. And it's not just, the senior US officials putting messages out like this. The media often feels like, when I look at my social media, I often feel like I'm looking at articles that are combating the two against each other, Europe versus the US, and sometimes even just being negative about each other. And again, these are just all articles that came up in the last few months in my news feed when I opened it up in the morning looking at LinkedIn or Twitter. One of our portfolio companies, a company called Signal AI, they analyze all the world's news in about 150 languages every day. They're able to do sentiment analysis across the news. We look to try and understand the truth. Is the media really trying to pit us against each other? Is it speaking very negatively about opposite ecosystems? So we looked at all the US reporting on European tech, European venture capital ecosystems over the last number of 6 months. For every one negative article that's in the media, there's almost 15 articles speaking positively in the US about the European VC ecosystem. And in Europe, you might say, well, Europe's feel a little bit attacked because so much of the US policy changes have changed negatively for us. But again, in European media, for every one negative article on US ecosystem, there's 13 positive articles. The media on both sides of the Atlantic is overwhelmingly positive about the other side. And I think what we as a group need to be careful about is negative voices often feel louder than the positive ones. And when you're looking at social media, unfortunately, they get more enhanced and more shared. And so in our kind of echo chambers, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter, we can feel like things are more negative than they are. But the data in this case is very clear. Both sides of the Atlantic media is overwhelmingly positive. Most of us are investors in the room. How important is each ecosystem to each other? So if we looked at the data, in Frontline, we invest in B2B companies, and we looked at the B2B tech IPO data. So when European companies are IPOing, what percentage of their revenues are coming from the US? You might have an idea or guess in your head. Well, the answer is, unsurprisingly, a lot. Over 40% on average, when a European B2B company is IPOing, revenue is coming from the US. That is an enormous amount of their revenue to be coming from the US. And I think for us, we need to be remembering, as we're advising our companies, again, not to be too isolationist. The US is a huge market. And we shouldn't be advising our companies to focus too much on Europe and forget about the rest of the world. The US is a huge market, and when you want to build global companies in Europe, you still need to be thinking internationally as well. Now, some of you might say, okay, well, that's easy. That's an example of Europe being too dependent on the US. We should be building our companies more at home. But what about the opposite direction? So when we look at the same data for B2B IPOs in the US, what percentage of their revenues do you think are coming from Europe when they IPO? What's interesting is when we ask most funds and entrepreneurs, they'll usually tell us somewhere between 5 and 10%. And I asked a few of you earlier as well, and I didn't get higher than 10%. The actual number is 30 to 40%. So like the reality is this isn't a one-way dependence. If you want to have a successful IPO, build a successful B2B tech company in the US, you also need to win the European market. And what's interesting as well, again, I don't have all the data here, but if you dive into that data, the companies that are closer to the 40% mark have far more successful IPO outcomes as well. Europe and the US are very intertwined. And when you're building and advising our companies, it's important not to forget that. This is B2B data, but again, if you look at the kind of consumer spend data, almost 75% of consumer tech spend is between Europe and the US. So for us, and we're focusing on these ecosystems, we should make sure that we're advising our companies to think big and think globally. What's interesting is, we're talking about ecosystem building here. I know many of these investors in the room, and I know many of you think bigger than just building big companies. Part of the reason you do your jobs is because you want to be involved in world-changing technologies, world-advancing sciences. That's part of why it gets us excited when we meet those entrepreneurs really trying to change things. And one of the things I'd like to put forward is actually so many of the world's most incredible advancements over the last 100 years have been through direct collaboration across that Atlantic. Just to go through a few very quick ones. The first is, the foundation of the modern internet originally started in DARPA in the US with Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf creating ARPANET and TCP/IP protocols. But it wouldn't be the modern internet that we know today if it hadn't been their collaboration with CERN, with Tim Berners-Lee and Robert Cailliau creating HTTP and HTML. But that's maybe a slightly aging example. One much more recently, Dr. Kati Karikou and Dr. Drew Weissman, the two scientists that founded created the baseline science behind almost every single COVID-19 vaccine, a European and a US, both winning the Nobel Prize. The first companies or vaccines that came to market, BioNTech and Pfizer, a joint venture between a European and US company. The next was Moderna. The next was AstraZeneca, a European and US company. And even if you look at the two US companies that were first to get drugs to market, they're both led by European CEOs. These ecosystems are so incredibly intertwined. It's important we don't forget that. And, it's easy to pick two examples, but if I had more time, I could give you the exact same slides on the International Space Station, the Human Genome Project, the Large Hadron Collider, and the same with those cables I talked about going under the sea. Those wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for investors and engineers on both sides of the Atlantic over 150 years ago. And again, you can keep going. So what I would love for you to take away today from my talk is, the media and even sometimes the politicians and policy changes can make it feel like it's Europe versus the US. But actually, for those building companies and trying to make advancements in general for humanity, we should be thinking about Europe and the US in the way we advise our companies. And yes, it is definitely harder now to build a more globalized company, but that's up to us as investors to help our companies get past that and to continue to build global companies, because that's what builds big companies and changes things. Thank you very much for your time.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Welcome back to another episode of the EUVC podcast, hopefully the go-to place for European venture capital community. So you've just heard William McQuillan take the EUVC Summit stage to dismantle the myth of US versus Europe in tech. And now we're taking it one step further. In this episode, we sit down with Will. He is the founding partner at Frontline Ventures, of course, to unpack the big ideas behind his talk and explore what they mean for the future of European venture. From media narratives to market realities and policy blind spots, we dive into why winning globally means thinking transatlantically and why the smartest founders and VCs already are. William, that was my cue to start the conversation. Did I hit the mark in terms of what you were thinking?
I think so. And thank you again both for having me on the stage of the summit and to dive deeper into the topic today, Andres. Always a pleasure talking.
Of course. Will you open the talk by pointing out how dominant the Europe versus US narrative has become, even across the summit agenda itself? Why do you think that this framing is so tempting? And why is it ultimately counterproductive for VCs?
At a high level, it's topical. It's in the news, right? We have had this kind of official, unofficial alliance across the Atlantic for such a long time. And for the first time, really, we're having a leader on one side of the Atlantic in a very long time who really is having a very different viewpoint and is becoming, for almost 100 years, is becoming more anti-trade across the Atlantic. And so I think that worries people. And when people are worried, things become top of mind. And we'll talk about this again when we talk about the press stuff. But negative sentiment tends to sit higher and more front of mind for people. And it makes people worry more and gives more people anxiety. And so an agenda at a summit like yours, where it's talking about what's happening in venture, is obviously going to lean more towards what's topical right now today. And what is topical is there is more friction than there used to be.
I got to ask you, Will, because when you make this point that it defeats the purpose or it's counterproductive to be talking about US versus Europe, where do you land on this whole tech sovereignty point that is so powerful right now? Because on the one hand, I get it 100% and I feel it very much. Like, we got to protect Europe. We got to put ourselves in a different position. On top of that, there's also a very strong narrative that's beneficial for all of us who are trying to raise money for stuff that in the end increases the competitiveness of Europe. So it's also it's a very nice narrative to be able to bring together with your fundraising deck. Back me and you help back Europe. But on the other hand, I definitely also get your point saying tech is global. Everything we do here in Europe will naturally go to the States. We will probably also, if they're in a bit of a dubious place or from a founder origin, you might say, let's just structure a Delaware company from the beginning. Or you might say, let's flip it in Series A or B stage. You know that you're going to make a lot of decisions down the line that are actually counterproductive for European sovereignty. This is kind of the dilemma I see as in, on the one hand, we very much lean in, but on the other hand, the dynamics of venture can kind of lead us astray when it comes to actually helping European sovereignty.
I can't erase patriotism. People will always be patriotic and passionate about where they come from. That's never going to go away. But the reality is that for our industry, venture capital funds are trying to pick the most ambitious entrepreneurs to build the most, enormously large companies. And you can't do that, or almost never can do that, in just one country. And what I tried to get across in the talk is that there is a lot of data that argues the opposite. And yes, like at all levels, the press often puts US versus Europe. LPs often have allocation for Europe or the US in venture capital. Entrepreneurs often think I should get a US or European investor. And the reality is that when you look at the data, if you're building big global companies, the ones that venture capitalists want to build, you've got to win both sides of the Atlantic. Those LPs are getting exposure. If they're investing in the top funds in Europe or the top funds in the US, the companies that they're investing in through those funds are ending up getting exposure to both sides of the Atlantic anyway. And so the reality is that that's the point I'm trying to get across in the myth. The press pits us against each other, and the LPs often allocate us differently. But if you really dig down to the revenue that the companies they're investing in are generating, it's coming from both sides. And so that's why I'm saying it's a bit of a myth and a fallacy to try and always say Europe versus the US. Realistically, it's Europe and the US in how people are actually allocating the revenues and the companies that they're building.
Do you have a hack for yourself to avoid the narrative of pitching US versus Europe? Because we are bombarded with it all the time from the media. It is a very convenient story to tell yourself. So it's hard, I find, to not go into the US versus Europe track.
Yeah,
even though I know that it's a bit
I think it depends who you're talking to. So if I'm speaking to the most ambitious entrepreneurs, they know that they need to win both markets. So if I'm a seed investor in Europe and I'm talking to an entrepreneur in Europe, almost definitely, if they're one of the top most ambitious entrepreneurs in Europe, they're going to be thinking about the US from very early on because they know they need to win both markets. Similar for like top tier US companies, like they know that pre-IPO, like a lot of US companies have 30 to 40% of revenues are coming from Europe. And so if they want to build a huge company, they're leaving a lot on the table by not targeting Europe. So when you're targeting entrepreneurs, it's easy to not fall into the trap of pitching one or the other. I think when it comes to talking to LPs, that's where it's a bit different because a lot of LPs do come with agendas or patriotic passions or geographic allocations specific. And so I think in that case, it gets a little bit more difficult for fund managers. I think you have to pitch your product in the right way to the audience you're pitching it to. So it can be slightly different depending on who you're speaking to.
Well, Frontline is structured around transatlantic expansion, seeding Europe growth in the US. We've done a full episode with your partner, Will Prendergast, on this. So I don't want to dive super deeply into it. Anyone should go and listen to that if they want to understand the pros and cons of that.
Yeah,
but
Will's the second best Will at Frontline, just
yes.
in case anyone was wondering. Yeah.
And second best Will in Europe, of course. Now, what made you build this model? Because I do think that we should just touch on it for those that don't know Frontline and haven't listened to that episode. Just a few seconds here. What made you build this model and how has it given you an edge over the more geographically siloed funds?
Yeah, so very quick summary. Frontline is a dual strategy fund. We have a seed fund, which invests in early stage companies in Europe and helps those companies get into the US. And then we have a growth fund that invests in later stage series B, C, D stage companies in the US and helps them come into Europe. I won't go into too much detail about the different stage. Will talks a lot about that in his podcast. But the reason we do that is what I was just touching on a second ago. We looked at the data and we looked at if you're building the biggest, in our case, B2B companies, if you're building the biggest B2B companies, the data is super clear. You need to win both sides of the Atlantic to build global companies. And we noticed that just most investors were very regionally focused and US focused, European focused. And we thought that was missing one of the key elements in what you need to build these global companies. And so we kind of did this kind of almost cross section of like, what are the most important things that a company needs to achieve to become a big global company? And what do the entrepreneurs care about and what will they remember? And when you kind of do that axis, what kind of comes right at the top of like what's most important and what entrepreneurs do care about is like international expansion. They need help with it. It's hard and it's meaningful to them and it's really important to the company. And that's why we focused on that. There's lots of other things that are table stakes around, building trust and being there for the entrepreneur and helping in other ways. But that's where we really try to zero in our focus and how we add value because we know how meaningful it is to the entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and I just will urge anyone to go and listen to the other episode because it is a very interesting deep dive and you get to really understand how building a network in the US by having the growth fund there is giving you a lot of both benchmark points, but also it allows you to land companies better over there.
Yeah,
and of course the opposite.
The great thing about both strategies is it's very much like 1 + 1 = 3. Our seed fund is constantly hearing about everything that's happening in Europe. And so that really helps our growth fund in understanding how those US companies can expand into Europe. Our growth fund is constantly meeting with all the top funds and all the top entrepreneurs in the US. And so that helps us understand the bar and also what's happening in the US for our European companies expanding across there. The two firms, although having separate investment teams, very much are collaborating at all times to make sure that both sides are understanding the opposite.
Now, Will, you shared some very interesting data from a research study you did yourselves. It's perception versus data, so to say, what the media gets wrong. You spoke about how media sentiment often paints a very bleak picture, but your data states very differently. Can you tell us a bit about that analysis, dive a bit deeper than what you did at the summit and what you learned from it?
Yeah, so firstly, for people listening, the data was all done through a tool called Signal AI. It's one of our portfolio companies. Signal analyzes all the world's news in 150 plus languages every single day, plus also social media. It's able to do sentiment analysis across that. So we're able to look at how is US media speaking about the European VC and tech ecosystem, and how is European media speaking about the US tech and VC ecosystem, and what sentiments was attached to that. And what was interesting was that the reason we did that analysis was because I thought what I was going to show is this like rising negativity since Trump has been elected, where both ecosystems have been building in anti-sentiment against each other, because that's what it felt like. That's what it feels like when I open social media. When I talk to people, it feels like that's what they're saying. That's the things that are being shared. And actually, I was surprised. The data didn't prove out the thesis that I thought. What it actually showed is that overwhelmingly, both the US media and the European media are positive about each other's ecosystems. In the US's case, for every one negative article that's being written about the European media and European ecosystem, there's like 14 and a half, it's almost 15 articles being written positively about the European VC and tech ecosystem. And in Europe, for every one negative article that's written about the US tech and VC ecosystem, there's 13 positive articles. So like overwhelmingly, the sentiment is positive. And what it made me then dive deeper is, well, how is it that I felt, and my team and other people I spoke to felt, that it's getting more and more negative? And what I realized is actually, it is more of a picture of the current social media world that we live in. If we looked at the media as if it was just a newspaper, it would be overwhelmingly positive about each other's ecosystems. But the problem is that social media is not a newspaper, and it amplifies certain messages more than others. And when you look into like the kind of the sociological studies of social media, negative articles are shared substantially more than positive articles, unfortunately. And there's, you know, there's a bunch of, like Cambridge Judge Business School did a really big research, but there's tons of research on this, and everything always points to the same thing. Negative articles are shared far more. They're clicked on far more. And so I think that actually the message I wanted to get across in this talk is that it feels like there's a lot more negative sentiment at the moment, but that's because it's a mix of both. A, people are more likely to share negative articles, and B, we're all kind of in our own echo chambers. And that's what my echo chamber is echoing at the moment, because it feels, you know, like there is this rising tension between the two.
Can I ask you, Will, and I've asked other people this on the podcast as well, the way I kind of wrote it to everyone in the beginning when I was starting to assemble the team to go on stage at the summit was that the people with the biggest megaphones in the US tech ecosystem have, for whatever reason, unanimously come down on the side of dunking on Europe. There's no reason to name and shame or blame, or because I don't think they would think it as shaming, but obviously the all-in crowd, not very big fans of Europe.
They're not all in on Europe, really.
No, they're not all in on Europe. They literally have in their jingles something along the lines of them chanting "Leave Europe alone." And then you have Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, obviously also pulling out of Europe from an investment perspective, but also very much espousing that the US tech agenda first also means that there's a competitive rivalry between US and the rest of the world. And for that reason, I think that they are leading, at least what I see in their messaging, they're leading the charge in terms of you also back US first. And they're not big on Europe either. I'd love to ask you, Will, one, we then dig between or dig below this layer of the people that are virtue signaling, which they would hate to be said they do themselves, but the people that are virtue signaling on the big platforms. But then what are the hallway conversations that are happening between you and your LPs in the US or your co-investors in the US? Is it in any way reflected that?
I think what Trump coming into power has done is it's given people more freedom to share an opinion they might not have shared before. But Andreessen was always not particularly interested in Europe as A16Z. They were never that into Europe. The All In podcast was never that into Europe. They just now feel more free that they can say those things because, you know, the president is frequently tweeting negative things. The vice president and secretary of defense is talking about hating and loathing Europe and in messages between each other, right? You know, like that unfortunately is a key narrative that's coming across in the US at the moment. The reality is that's not what the data is showing. And that's not where you see it. I'm like, you know, even ACC&Z with their narrative about like American patriotism or whatever it is, you're like, I saw them competing for a deal in Europe recently, right? So like the reality is that there are still tons of US investors messaging us every week, looking at deals in Europe. And there's still tons of European companies looking to expand it to the US and tons of US companies looking to expand it to Europe. We aren't seeing a slowdown in that. Again, I think the message I try to get across is for the venture ecosystem and maybe policymakers to be very careful that certain loud voices are not clearly representing the masses because the data isn't changing. We're not seeing a massive drop-off in US investment to Europe relative to other drop-offs that are just happening in the market, and vice versa. So I think that just be careful that there's certain very loud voices that feel like they have a stage at the moment, but I don't think that represents the majority of either ecosystem, as was demonstrated with both kind of the data from the tech articles, but it's also demonstrated by investing data, right? Like there's still lots of US investment coming into Europe.
Yeah, and I wanted to drill down on this exactly because of the discrepancy between what the big megaphones on social media say and what's actually happening, both in data, and we should talk about that now. So both the market data, but also just sentiment with the actual people that are investing and active in the ecosystem. I said, let's talk about data and let's talk about the market. You have a very interesting stat in your talk, which said that when European B2B tech companies IPO, more than 40% of their revenue comes from the US. But at the same time, and this is the thing that surprises everyone, I think, the reverse is also the same. So the US B2B tech companies that IPO, they see 30 to 40% of their revenue coming from Europe. This number baffles everyone. I don't think there's a lot that make that guess if you ask them. So could you tell me a bit about what this teaches you and what you think the message should be to the market about this?
Yeah, and again, for really didn't see the talk, this is data looking at kind of the last 10 years of B2B tech IPOs in Europe and the US. And, you know, we originally did it looking at US to Europe. I think a lot of people assume that European companies have to expand to the US. And like the reality is it's true, you know, 40% of revenue at IPO for the average B2B company IPOing in Europe, you know, that's a huge proportion of their revenue. I think a European company who's not thinking about the US, at least the B2B companies for sure, is really leaving an enormous portion of the market out of their scope. But I think that to your point, where people often misunderstand it is this isn't just a one-way dependent. It's not just like, oh, European companies have to win the US. It is absolutely both ways. And when we speak to most US investors and US CEOs, and we ask them, and actually European VCs as well, you know, when we ask them, how much revenue does a US company have in Europe when they're IPOing, right? And almost always they'll say somewhere between 5 and 10%. You know, there was someone at the summit the other day who guessed 3% when I asked them the question before the talk, right? Like the answer is 30 to 40%. Like they are almost as dependent in vice versa ways. Like that is a huge proportion of their revenues to be coming from Europe. And so like, there's no question about it. If you're building a huge B2B global company in the US, if you want to build an IPO track company, you need to be winning Europe too. And not just like having a foot on the ground there. Like you need to have substantial market share coming from the US, from Europe. And I think that, not only that, but like when you dive into the data, we have a, just to plug one of our reports, you know, we have the kind of the US playbook and we also have the kind of the European expansion report, which dives into a lot of this data. But effectively, when you look at the companies that are closer to the 40% of the revenue in Europe at IPO, the US companies, you know, they perform better at IPO than the ones that are lower at the like mid 20s to 30%. And so again, it's not even just like, it's a big part of your market share, but also it helps you perform better at IPO. That's what the IPO investors are saying by the data coming.
Yeah. And Will, now we're going to shift a bit to actually tap your brain, not as a commenter on market dynamics and so on, but rather as a VC that's helping build companies. Because I'd love to ask you about the collaboration as a competitive advantage, so to say. So you state just what you did just before, but you also have concrete examples in your talk with DARPA and CERN and BioNTech and Pfizer that really show how the partnerships that span oceans allow us to create innovation in a way that is rarely seen in other places. Where do you see that this playbook can be applied to the companies that are building, both in the US, but let's focus primarily on the European seed stage companies? How do you help them go to the States and get this collaboration made? What is the core thing for a VC that's trying to do their best work to learn?
Yeah, and again, just maybe to give the context of that point, you know, initially I was looking for examples of like big world-changing things that have happened through European and US collaboration. And the more I looked, I was like, oh, that happened through European, the Large Hadron Collider, or like, or the International Space Station, or the example I gave in the talk, you know, the COVID-19 vaccine, which is a ridiculous example of European and US collaboration. The internet, again, European-US collaboration, and even like the transatlantic cables, which I kind of put a map up on in the talk, again, would never have happened without engineers and investors on both sides of the Atlantic working together. That suddenly made me realize, like, okay, you know, I think for a lot of VCs, for a lot of entrepreneurs, for a lot of policymakers, they work in this area not just to build big companies. They work in it to try and advance humanity, build like world-changing sciences and technologies. And the more I looked into it, so much of it was around collaboration. And that's why for us, it overemphasizes the importance of this. And then to your question, for European companies looking to expand into the US and have collaboration there, I think there are many different aspects about that. And I think I've spoken in more length in the last podcast, and I'd recommend people to look at our European expansion, our US, playbook, where it goes into 90 pages of detail. We made the report as a tool for a European entrepreneur getting on the plane to the US. You can easily digest it and reflect on it by the time you've landed. But effectively, a lot of it's around understanding what your go-to-market is and how that might change in the US, how you might need to localize or change your product. A lot of people think immediately Silicon Valley is the right place to expand, but actually when you look at the data, the vast majority of European companies choose East Coast because when it comes to collaboration, it's much easier from a time zone perspective to build and manage your teams across both. But for your customers in the Valley, well, then maybe you need to make that work either way. And so I think there is no, this is the right way to do it. It is different per company, but there are a lot of learnings from a lot of the companies that have already done it. And I'd highly recommend people to read that report. And for the VCs who are advising their companies, Frontline are always surprised at how many VCs we speak to who encourage their companies to stay in Europe for a long time before they start expanding to the US. And we think that is a mistake. And we think that the data clearly shows that. And companies that expand earlier almost always will perform better. And there are, of course, exceptions. And there are certain types of companies that might be better suited to stay a bit longer. But for the majority of B2B technology companies, you should be thinking about the US from very early on in your journey. And thinking about that means spending time there, understanding it. It's not just thinking in 3 years' time, we're going to expand there. It's actually investing time and resources into that as well. And I think we see European companies doing that too late, and they're missing out on a lot of potential growth in the US.
Just a note here, we did in the conversation with Will Prendergast also talk more about that and the playbook specifically. So I won't dive much further there. Instead, I'd love to ask you.
Maybe not to interrupt you, but maybe one thing to understand is what is the driving force of why we encourage European companies to go earlier into the US and US companies to come later into Europe? The thing that most people need to understand is that most of the risk takers in Europe left on boats 150 years ago to the US. And so the founding culture of the US was a group of very risk-taking Europeans. The founding current culture of the US is a bunch of very risk-taking Europeans. So by definition, that was their founding culture, this idea of taking risk. And what was left was a Europe that had a lot less risk takers and therefore a more conservative culture. Now, is there risk takers in Europe today? Of course there are. The average company in Europe, when making business decisions, is more conservative than the average US company is. US companies are far more likely to work with an early stage company. And so what we see is our early stage companies in Europe get faster traction. So their lead time reduces, their account sizes increase when they start expanding to the US. Now, the whole point of our US to Europe strategy is that Europe is still a huge market, but it's a little bit more conservative. So expanding throughout Europe is so much easier once you have that bit of extra traction. And that early traction, we believe, is far easier to get in the US. And that's kind of the foundational reasons why we do them at different stages.
Do you think, Will, and now I'm going to ask you to get in trouble here, do you think that your European counterparts are for the wrong absorbed reasons? Well, they have a good value add, they have good network, they have all the reasons to kind of feel more important and more value adding and helpful to the founders if they stay in Europe. And do you think that it's for that type of reason? Do you think it's because they just don't understand what you just described? Why do you think that we are seeing European VCs maybe keeping their companies too long?
Yeah, I don't want to generalize about European venture capital. The reality is we started Frontline 2012, and at that time European venture capital wasn't in a great place, in my opinion. It is now evolved enormously since then. I think some of the other speakers spoke to how much more venture capital funding there is in European ecosystem, and many of those newer funds are great funds. And I don't want to say to entrepreneurs, you should never work with a European investor and all the European investors are small-minded investors. I don't think that's true. I think there's lots of really great European investors that if I was an entrepreneur, I'd be extremely happy to work with. To your point, though, a lot of people always find it easier to do what they know and to expand in areas that they know. It's often simpler to take the easy path than the right path. The easy path doesn't necessarily mean to be the wrong path, but it isn't necessarily the best path to go. And we're trying to maximize the potential for each of these entrepreneurs and the companies that they're building. And we believe the best way to maximize that is through that early US expansion. And we've kind of designed our firm around that. Different people will have different views to that. And sometimes that's driven because it's the easier route. Sometimes it's driven because of LP desires. Sometimes it's driven through patriotism. But, that's our viewpoint. And it also, we see it as a magnet and filter where we think the most ambitious entrepreneurs also understand that in Europe. They know that if they want to build a global company, they've got to win the US market. And the earlier they start at that, the better chance they have. And we try to specialize in helping them do that. And so we think that also, by creating our firm around that, helps us kind of show the best entrepreneurs that they should be working with people like us.
If we just talk for a second about round composition, who do you get into the round? Do you think that if you're doing a seed stage round, you're, as a founder or an angel or whatever that's trying to help put that together, are making a mistake if you're not either having US investors in the round or someone with the mindset of you and the strong value add around going to the US?
I think every entrepreneur should think about, what are the biggest challenges I'm going to face in the next 18 to 24 months? And who are the best investors for helping me do that and helping me solve those problems or helping me get past those challenges? And that might be angels, that might be venture capital funds, that might mean you do one fund takes the whole round. It might be that you have two funds doing, you might have a fund with a number of angels or micro funds. There's some amazing micro funds and solar GPs in the ecosystem at the moment in Europe. So I think it's really specific. And we always, when we meet with entrepreneurs, we'll ask them, what do we think their biggest challenges are? Because I know I will be able to solve every one of their big challenges. And I'll then try to specifically help bring in investors who I think can help solve those challenges. And it isn't always a US investor. It isn't always a European investor. It can totally vary. But I try to see who can really, open up the right doors or put out the big fires that might be coming, because every company is slightly different. And so that's why I think you need to give a bit more of a nuanced answer to that. There isn't you should just have US investors or US thinking investors in your round.
Will, I want to spend the last couple of minutes that we have together on talking a bit about the consequences of everything you're seeing here for the ecosystem builders and politicians and policymakers. Because what I am feeling, so it's been forever that in Europe, we had Marius also coming on on stage, former CXO at UiPath, coming on stage, showing a map of Europe, saying, if this map, which is full of dots, is showing every European version of Silicon Valley that's ever been proclaimed by policymakers. And everyone laughed because, of course, the map was completely dotted. And this has kind of been a bit my mission in when talking to policymakers, especially here in Denmark, is you got to remember that you cannot just always try and build a local version of whatever, because if you want to do anything in venture, it's by design global and at the very least European. So you can't bring the best Danish investors together to talk about this ecosystem, because you're only going to get maybe one or two that are globally amongst the best, and then the rest are not amongst the best, which means they're not bringing the best playbook there, and they're not bringing the right considerations to fore. I kind of am afraid that we're now, because even though we are seeing globalization maybe retracting a little bit, I do think that this, as you're also starting out with, this statement of putting Europe versus the US all the time, if we end up building too much our ecosystems around European sovereignty, we might be doing the same mistakes again, but just on a European level, because we're not centering the development of the AI ecosystem in Paris around a corridor to the US, but instead we're building it around Europe. Or do you think we're making a mistake here?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. And like, I'm not a policy expert, a politician or a diplomat. My general belief is that we should always be focusing on creating more talent. So, if you're asking me to kind of wave magic wands, I'd love people to, because the great thing about venture is we can take really long-term bets and really long-term views. And I would love to see just more focus on funding great universities across Europe. That I think would help our ecosystem. Our universities are substantially underfunded in Europe compared to US universities. If you want to do a Europe versus the US, if that's kind of where the question is leading. And so, the reality is I'd love to see more of that. I think that will lead to far more amazing technologies and science that's developed in Europe. The other thing, though, is not to forget that, like, just because a company is created in the US doesn't mean that's not great for Europe. You know, Google employs, I mean, I don't know what the number is, tens of thousands, over 100,000 people in Europe. I don't know what the number is, but definitely tens of thousands of people in Europe. So would Facebook, so would a lot of these, or Meta, so would a lot of these big US tech companies. A lot of European big companies employ tens of thousands of people in the US too. Again, if we can continue to promote the collaboration, to me, the more collaboration, the bigger, the better things that we can build. And I think the US and Europe has had this incredible collaboration. You know, I would love if there were other regions of the world that we created more collaboration with too. At the moment, we've just got, you know, a 100-year track record of great collaboration between US and Europe. So I just don't think we should throw that away and forget about it or think that it's the wrong thing to be doing. I also think if I was to wave a magic wand, you know, never going to happen. Well, not never, but not going to happen anytime soon, is, you know, Brexit was a real blow for the European ecosystem. You know, you've got London, which is one of the biggest hubs in Europe, suddenly cut off properly from the rest of the towns in Europe, or largely cut off. I think that's a real blow. And so I think there won't be a, hey, Brexit's gone, but I think slowly unwinding that, anything politicians can do to unwind that will make a better European ecosystem in general.
Well, that was definitely not something that will probably fall poorly with anyone in our audience, but it could get you a beating in certain bars. I love to ask you, Will, because I was talking to my dad actually the other day about the fact that, so this whole discussion or pitting Europe versus the US and trying to almost, to me, it feels like unwind a lot of the entanglement that we already have, or the dependencies. I'm a bit like, okay, we're definitely seeing some interesting things come out of the White House. We probably have a bit of a new situation, and the world could go in a different direction than we had thought. But let's just agree that it's probably a better thing that we still tap into the most powerful alliance that we've had for years and years and years, and also the strongest players. And my conversation with my dad was specifically around this untanglement or ripping out the US created tech stack of Microsoft and Google and so on from critical infrastructure and so on here in Denmark, where I'm a bit like, I get that you are a bit afraid that they might have a kill switch or whatever with respect to critical infrastructure for us, and even non-critical, honestly. But really, it's not a very likely scenario. And the fact of the matter is that everything that's happening today with AI is allowing the behemoths to do incredible strides forward compared to what a small scale company in Denmark offering the same type of infrastructure service can. As an example, I'm getting everything recorded with Google, and they're allowing me to search everything by the click of a button. I'd much rather that my healthcare system was allowed to do that by tapping into the US tech ecosystem and their services, rather than us trying to create some weird Danish version that's then not, at least it can't be killed by the US. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue against a Danish person on their views, though, because I think you guys constantly get named like happiest country in the world, don't you? Right?
Yeah, well, we're very happy. That doesn't mean that.
But no, I think, look, I'm biased. I clearly have a more globalist view, and I think that collaboration across regions, across cultures, creates better sciences, technologies, advances for humanity. I think the data and history clearly shows that. Equally, I think that takes longer term thinking, and longer term thinking is very hard for politicians, because politicians are looking for near term votes. They're looking for near term press positivity, and especially in, again, this negatively driven social media world. So I can understand why it's hard for politicians to not always kind of, like, if you're a Danish politician, why are you going to be saying, hey, we should be supporting US companies landing in Europe? Like, does that win you a lot of votes in Denmark? Maybe, but you cutting a ribbon beside a new cool startup office in Denmark and Copenhagen probably wins you more votes in the press and with your constituents. So I think it's hard for politicians. I'm not trying to say it's easy, and I don't think I have the answers for them, but I'm definitely not a politician, and I'm focused on, like, what does it take to kind of support the top entrepreneurs. And maybe the final point I made in my talk, which may be a good point to end, is like, I'm not like delusional. There is more friction now to do business across the Atlantic than there was a year ago, 2 years ago. But I feel like that's the responsibility of the investors, both in the US and Europe, to be helping the entrepreneurs to cover that cross-Atlantic collaboration, because the data is clear. You got to win both markets if you want to build global companies. And yes, it's harder to do that now, but then it's on the investors to make sure that we can help our entrepreneurs to continue to do that and get past that friction.
Yeah. Well, final question. Throughout the podcast, I've been trying to get you in trouble, asking you to take a stance on policy questions. You've said multiple times, I'm not a politician.
Definitely not a politician.
The role of VCs in politics, do you think that there is one, or do you think we should stay to our swim lane?
I think VCs already have a pretty good reputation for being arrogant. And I think there's plenty of US technologists and VCs at the moment who are diving headfirst into politics. Like, the reality is, I can talk to you or your audience about technology, building companies, entrepreneurship, but I'm not an expert in how to manage a healthcare system or prison reform or like social care systems. And realistically, we are a small island that tries its best to have a big impact, but there's still so many parts that politicians have to juggle and manage that are far beyond my pay grade. I think technology and science is incredibly important for furthering everything, but investment in it does not guarantee it comes from your country, your constituency. You have to take a global view to it. And so that's why I think it's hard for politicians. So I prefer to argue kind of how to build kind of something bigger. I think as a politician, I think that would be hard for me to do. So it doesn't attract me to jump into politics. If politicians want advice, I'll always give it, but that's because I like to talk. So yeah. So you won't be able to easily pull me into, running for office anytime soon, I don't think.
I do definitely not want any VCs to run for office. I don't think that is not my mission. My mission, though, is to get the technologists that are backing the future and spending all their time thinking about what allows us to build a better future and what technologies do we need to bet on, how will they impact society, all these things. If we don't get into that conversation more as VCs, I think we're leaving a lot at the table. And I think that the US playbook that we've seen play out, definitely not one to copy. On the one hand,
no,
at least not their stances. I think actually their operational playbook is quite interesting. When we look at what they have been able to achieve in the tech ecosystem and power to affect their changes and what they think in their mind in policy, is quite interesting. And I do think it's quite important. I do think one of our powers in Europe is that we are nuanced and we are also more humble. Even the braggy VCs we have are more humble than the non-braggy US VCs in many places, I think. So for that reason, I really think that your voice is incredibly important to get into those hallways more.
Thank you, Andreas. That's exactly what my ego needs to hear. So,
and I was about to say, I deliberately spoke for so long about this that you will not be able to replicate or to reciprocate. So, well, now I just have to say thank you so much for taking the time and going a minute over time with me.
That's good. Andreas, thank you for the time as always. And thank you everyone for listening.
Before you go, I just want to give a massive shout out to the partners who made the EUVC Summit and Awards possible. So please do not tune out. We're partnered with these firms because they're great people with offerings that we know from our friends in the ecosystem are truly world-class. First up, I want to give a big thanks to HSBC Innovation Banking. They helped us incept the awards in the very beginning, and truly, they are the leading bank for anyone in European venture. There's a reason why everyone knows them. Google Cloud, they were our venue hosted the summit. What a team, what a big effort they put on to help us. We're hugely grateful. Make sure to reach out to Arabella or Oksana at the Google Cloud team to hear how they can help you as well as your portfolio. Massive credits goes to them. Ace Alternatives, we have so many friends in the Berlin ecosystem partnered with these guys. Just the best fund ops team around. And as with any good restaurant, where the locals are is also where you get the best service. And now they're expanding across Europe, so they're definitely someone to talk to. Haynespoon, they're longtime partners of ours in both our own legal work. They're great supporters of us here at the EUVC, and I definitely think that they are one of the go-to legal teams to have in your corner. CW Communications, our dear friends who helped us secure CNBC, Bloomberg, Financial Times, and many more for this summit. It's a joy working with Dan and Kathy and the team. The Fundcraft, digital native, full suite, Lux headquartered, and a great partner as you grow your firm out of Luxembourg. Definitely a fund admin to consider in your stack. I can only say that the team are incredible to work with. I'm very thankful that I've gotten to know them. I think they're one of the up and coming fund admins that you want to be thinking about. Portfolio IQ by Synaptic. You may know them for the Discover tool, which is branded under Synaptic, but Portfolio IQ is absolutely a product you should know because there's no one that understands intelligence better than this team. And finally, Goodwin. They are a truly world-class legal partner you can trust. They're hands-on, business-oriented, and expert in everything and anything transatlantic. So those were our partners for the summit and awards. I know this might have been a bit long and boring, but really, if you have these guys on your side, I don't think your firm could be in any better hands. And also, they're helping us do what we're doing every day for you.